Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff, and we're now in Chapter 55, Community Ecology. All the organisms that live together in a place are members of a community. The myriad of species that inhabit a tropical rainforest are a community, as are the species that live in a desert oasis. Indeed, every inhabited place on Earth supports its own particular array of organisms. Over time, the different species that live together have made many complex adjustments to community living, evolving together and forging relationships that give the community its character and stability. Look closely. The clownfish, pictured here, has evolved the ability to swim among the stinging tentacles of sea anemones without being injured. Both competition and cooperation have played key roles. In this chapter, we will look at these and other factors in what we call community ecology. Almost any place on Earth is occupied by species, sometimes by many of them, as in the rainforests of the Amazon, and sometimes by only a few, as in the near boiling waters of Yellowstone's geysers, where a number of microbial species live. The term community refers to the species that occur at any particular locality. For instance, I'll show you this. Communities can be characterized by either their constituent species or by their properties, such as species richness, the number of species present, or primary productivity, the amount of energy produced. Interactions among community members govern many ecological and evolutionary processes. These interactions, such as predation and mutualism, affect the population biology of the particular species, whether a population increases or decreases in abundance, for example, as well as the many ways in which energy and nutrients cycle through the ecosystem. Moreover, the community context affects the patterns of natural selection faced by a species, and thus the evolutionary course it takes. Scientists study biological communities in many ways, ranging from detailed observations to elaborate large-scale experiments. In some cases, studies focus on the entire community, whereas in other cases, they focus only on the subset of species that are likely to interact with one another. And in case you don't see this with your textbook out at the moment, this here is a community. It consists of all the species, the plants, animals, fungi, protists, and prokaryotes that occur at a locality. And in this case, this is Etosha National Park in Namibia. For the most part, species respond independently to changing environmental conditions. As a result, community composition usually changes gradually across landscapes, and some species appear to become more abundant, while others decrease in abundance and eventually disappear. A famous example of this pattern is the abundance of tree species in the Santa Catalina Mountains of Arizona along a geographic gradient running from very dry to very moist. In the figure shown, it shows that species change in abundance in patterns that are, for the most part, independent of one another. As a result, tree communities at different localities in these mountains fall on a continuum, one merging into the next, rather than representing discretely different sets of species. Similar patterns through time are seen in paleontological studies. For example, a very good fossil record exists for the trees and small mammals that have occurred in North America over the past 20,000 years. Examination of prehistoric communities shows little similarity to those that occur today. Many species that occur together today were never found together in the past. Conversely, species that used to occur in the same communities often do not overlap in their geographic ranges today. These findings suggest that as climate has changed during the waxing and waning of ice ages, species have responded independently rather than shifting in their distributions together. Nonetheless, in some cases, the abundance of species in a community does change geographically in a synchronous pattern. Often this occurs at ecotones, places where the environment changes abruptly. For example, in the western United States, certain patches of habitat have serpentine soils. This soil differs from normal soil in many ways. For example, high concentration of nickel, chromium, and iron, and low concentrations of copper and calcium. Comparison of the plant species that occur on different soil shows that distinct communities exist on each type, with an abrupt transition from one to the other over a short distance, which I'll show you here. Similar transitions are seen wherever greatly different habitats come into contact, such as at the interference between terrestrial and aquatic habitats, or where grassland and forest meet. And what's typical is that ecotones are very high in species diversity. Each organism in a community confronts the challenge of survival in a different way. The niche an organism occupies is the total of all the ways it uses the resources of its environment. A niche may be described in terms of space utilization, food consumption, temperature range, appropriate conditions for mating, requirements for moisture, and other factors. Sometimes species are not able to occupy their entire niche because of the presence or absence of other species. Species can interact with one another in a number of ways, and these interactions can have either positive or negative effects. One type of interaction, interspecific competition, occurs when two species use the same resource and there is not enough to satisfy both. Physical interactions over access to resources such as fighting to defend a territory or displacing an individual from a particular location are referred to as interference competition. Consuming the same resources is called exploitative competition. The entire niche that a species is capable of using, based on its physiological tolerance limits and resources needs, is called the fundamental niche. And that's everywhere that species can fundamentally exist and be found. The actual set of environmental conditions, including the presence or absence of other species in which the species can establish a stable population, is its realized niche. In other words, where it is actually found to occur and carry out its ecological interactions. Because of interspecific interactions, the realized niche of a species may be considerably smaller than its fundamental niche. A classic study investigated competitive interactions between two species of barnacles that grow together on rocks along the coast of Scotland. Thalamus stellatus lives in shallow water where tidal action often exposes it to air, and then Semibalanus bladenoides lives lower down, where it's rarely exposed to the atmosphere. You're seeing the figure before yourself. Space is at a premium where the two species come in contact. Semibalanus always outcompetes Thalamus by crowding it off the rocks, undercutting it, and replacing it even where it has begun to grow. An example of interference competition. Where Semibalanus was removed from the area where it occurs, however, Thalamus was easily able to occupy the deeper zone, indicating that no physiological or other general obstacles prevent it from becoming established there. In contrast, Semibalanus could not survive in the shallow water habitats where Thalamus normally occurs. it does not have the physiological adaptations to warmer temperatures that allow thalamus to occupy this zone. Thus, the fundamental niche of thalamus includes both shallow and deeper zones, but its realized niche is much narrower because thalamus can be outcompeted by semibalamus in parts of its fundamental niche. By contrast, the realized and fundamental niches of semibalamus appear to be identical. Processes other than competition can also restrict the realized niche of a species. For example, the plant St. John's wort was introduced and became widespread in open rangeland habitats in California until a specialized beetle was introduced to control it. The population size of the plant quickly decreased, and it is now only found in shady sites where the beetle cannot thrive. In this case, the presence of a predator limits the realized niche of a plant. In some cases, the absence of another species leads to a smaller realized niche. In many North American plants depend on insects for pollination. Indeed, the value of insect pollination for American agriculture has been estimated to be more than $25 billion a year. However, pollinator populations are currently declining for several reasons. Conservationists are concerned that if these insects disappear from some habitats, the realized niche of many plant species will decrease or even disappear entirely. In this case, the absence rather than the presence of another species will be the cause of a relatively small realized niche. In classic experiments carried out in 1934 and 35, Russian ecologist Georgy Gauss studied competition among 3 species of Paramecium, a tiny protist. Each of the 3 species grew well in culture tubes by themselves, preying on bacteria and yeasts that fed on the oatmeal suspended in the culture fluid. However, when Gauss grew Paramecium aurelia together with Paramecium caudatum in the same tube, the numbers of Paramecium caudatum always declined to extinction, leaving Paramecium aurelia the only survivor. Shown here in figure 55.5b. Why did this happen? Gauss found that Paramecium aurelia could grow 6 times faster than its competitor, Paramecium caudatum, because it was able to better utilize the limited available resources, an example of exploitative competition. From experiments such as this, Gauss formulated what is now called the principle of competitive exclusion. This principle states that if 2 species are competing for a limited resource, such as food or water, the species that uses the resource more efficiently will eventually eliminate the other locally. In other words, no 2 species with the same niche can coexist when resources are limiting. In a revealing experiment, Gauss challenged Paramecium caudatum, the defeated species, in his earlier experiment with a 3rd species, Paramecium bursaria, because he expected these 2 species to also compete for the limited bacterial food supply. Gauss thought one would win out, as had happened in his previous experiments, but that's not what happened. Instead, both species survived in the culture tubes, dividing the food resources. And that is what is shown in figure 55.5c. Species can and do exist. Species can and do coexist while competing for some of the same resources. But Gauss's hypothesis predicts that when 2 species coexist on a long-term basis, either resources must not be limited or their niches will always differ in one or more features. Otherwise, one species will outcompete the other, and the extinction of one of the second species will inevitably result. Gauss's competitive exclusion principle has a very important consequence. If competition for a limited resource is intense, then either one species will drive the other to extinction, or the species will evolve differences that reduce the competition between them. When the ecologist Robert MacArthur studied 5 species of warblers, small insect-eating forest songbirds, he discovered that they appeared to be competing for the same resources. But when he investigated in greater detail, he found that each species actually fed in a different part of the spruce trees and so ate different subsets of insects. One species fed on insects near the tips of branches, a second one within the dense foliage, a third one on the lower branches, a fourth high on the trees, and a fifth at the very apex of trees. Thus, each species of warbler had evolved so as to utilize a different portion of the spruce tree resource. They have subdivided the niche to avoid direct competition with one another. This niche subdivision is termed resource partitioning. Resource partitioning is often seen in similar species that occupy the same geographic region. Predation is the consuming of one organism by another. In this sense, predation includes everything from a leopard capturing and eating antelope to a deer grazing on spring grass. When experimental populations are set up under simple laboratory conditions, as illustrated in Figure 55.9, the predatory protist Didymnum and its prey, Paramecium, the predator, often exterminates its prey and then becomes extinct itself, having nothing left to eat. If refuges are provided for the Paramecium, however, its population drops to low levels but not to extinction. Low prey population levels then provide inadequate food for Didymnum, causing the predator population to decrease. When this occurs, the prey population can recover. In nature, predators often have large effects on prey populations. As the previous example indicates, however, the interaction is a two-way street. Prey can also affect the dynamics of the predator populations. The outcomes of such interactions are complex and depend on a variety of factors. Some of the most dramatic examples of the interconnection between predators and their prey involve situations in which humans have either added predators to or eliminated predators from an area. For example, the elimination of large carnivores from much of the eastern United States has led to population explosions of white-tailed deer, which strip the habitat of all edible plant life within their reach. Similarly, when sea otters were hunted to near extinction on the west coast of the United States, populations of sea urchins, a principal prey item of the otters, exploded. Conversely, the introduction of rats, dogs, and cats to many islands across the world has led to the decimation of native fauna. Populations of Galapagos tortoises on several islands are endangered by introduced rats, pigs, dogs, and cats, which eat the eggs and the young tortoises. Similarly, in New Zealand, several species of birds and reptiles have been eradicated by rat predation and now occur only on a few offshore islands that rats have not reached. On one such island, every individual of the now extinct Stevens Island wren was killed by a single lighthouse keeper's cat. Predation involves strong selective pressures on prey populations. Any feature that decreases the probability of capture should be strongly favored. In turn, the evolution of such features causes natural selection to favor counter-adaptations in predator populations. The process by which the adaptations are selected in lockstep fashion in two or more interacting species is termed coevolution. A coevolutionary arms race may ensue in which predators and prey are constantly evolving better defenses and better means of circumventing these defenses. In the sections that follow, you'll learn about these defenses and responses. Plants have evolved many mechanisms to defend themselves from herbivores. Most obvious are morphological defenses, such as thorns, spines, and prickles play an important role in discouraging large plant eaters and plant hairs, especially those that have glandular sticky tip that deter insect herbivores. Some plants, such as grasses, deposit silica in their leaves, both strengthening and protecting themselves. If enough silica is present, these plants are simply too tough to eat. As significant as morphological adaptations are, the chemical defenses that occur so widely in plants are even more widespread. Plants exhibit some amazing chemical adaptations to combat herbivores. For example, recent work demonstrates that when attacked by caterpillars, wild tobacco plants emit a chemical in the air that attracts a species of bug that feeds on the caterpillar. The best known and perhaps most important of the chemical defenses of plants against herbivores are secondary chemical compounds. These chemicals are distinguished from primary compounds, which are the compounds of a major metabolic pathway such as respiration. Many plants and apparently many algae as well contain structurally diverse secondary compounds that are either toxic to most herbivores or disturb their metabolism greatly, preventing, for example, the normal development of larval insects. Consequently, most herbivores tend to avoid plants that possess these compounds. The mustard family, Brassicaceae, produces a group of chemicals known as mustard oils. These substances give the pungent aromas and taste to plants such as mustard, cabbage, watercress, radish, and horseradish. Although we enjoy these flavors, the chemicals are toxic to many groups of insects. Similarly, the plants of the milkweed family, Asclepiaceae, and the related dogbane family, Apocynaceae, produce a milky sap that deters herbivores from eating them. In addition, these plants usually contain cardiac glycosides, molecules that can produce drastic deleterious effects to heart functions of vertebrates. Some herbivores have evolved ways of circumventing plant defenses, allowing them to feed on plants without harm, often as their exclusive food source. For example, cabbage fly butterfly caterpillars feed almost exclusively on plants of the mustard and caper families, as well as on a few other small families of plants that also contain mustard oils. Similarly, caterpillars of monarch butterflies and their relatives feed on plants of the milkweed and dogbane families. How do these animals manage to avoid the chemical defenses of the plants, and what are the evolutionary precursors and ecological consequences of such patterns of specialization? We can offer a potential explanation for the evolution of these particular patterns. Once the ability to manufacture mustard oils evolved in the ancestors of the caper and mustard families, the plants were protected for a time against most or all herbivores that were feeding on other plants in their area. At some point, certain groups of insects, for example, cabbage butterflies, evolved the ability to break down mustard oils and thus fed on those plants without harming themselves. Having developed this new capability, the butterflies were able to use a new resource without competing with other herbivores. So, exposure to an underutilized resource often leads to evolutionary diversification and adaptive radiation. Some animals that feed on plants rich in secondary compounds receive an extra benefit. For example, when caterpillars of monarch butterflies feed on plants of the milkweed family, they do not break down the cardiac glycosides that protect these plants from herbivores. Instead, the caterpillars concentrate and store these compounds in fat bodies. They often retain them through the chrysalis stage to the adult stage and even to the eggs of the next generation. The incorporation of the cardiac glycosides protects all stages of the monarch butterfly life cycle from predators. A bird that eats a monarch butterfly quickly regurgitates it, as you can see before yourself here, and in the future avoids the conspicuous orange and black pattern that characterizes the adult monarch. Some bird species have evolved the ability to tolerate the protective chemicals. These birds eat the monarchs. Chemical defenses. Animals also manufacture a startling array of defensive substances. Bees, wasps, predatory bugs, scorpions, spiders, and many other arthropods use chemicals to defend themselves and to kill their own prey. In addition, various chemical defenses have evolved among many marine invertebrates, as well as a variety of vertebrates, including frogs, snakes, lizards, fishes, and some birds. Frogs of the Dendrobatidae family, abundant in the forests of Central and South America, are extremely poisonous to vertebrates. More than 200 different toxic alkaloids have been identified from different species in this genus. They advertise their toxicity with a bright coloration, as you see here. Poison dart frogs. Many insects that feed on milkweed plants are brightly colored. They advertise their poisonous nature using an ecological strategy known as warning coloration. Showy coloration is a characteristic of animals that use poisons and stings to repel predators. Organisms that lack specific chemical defenses are seldom brightly colored. In fact, many have cryptic coloration, color that blends in with the surroundings and thus hides them from individual predators, such as you see here. Camouflage animals usually do not live together in groups because a predator that discovers one individual gains a valuable clue to the presence of others. So you're seeing a caterpillar of a type of moth, the waved umber, is camouflaged and closely resembles a twig on which it is hanging. During the course of evolution, many species have come to resemble distasteful ones that exhibit warning coloration. The mimic gains an advantage by looking like the distasteful model. Two types of mimicry have been identified: Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry. Batesian mimicry, named for Henry Bates, the British naturalist who first brought this type of mimicry to general attention in 1857. In his journeys to the Amazon region of South America, Bates discovered many instances of palatable insects that resembled brightly colored distasteful species. He reasoned that the mimics would be avoided by predators who would be fooled by the disguise into thinking the mimic was the distasteful species. Many of the best known examples of Batesian mimicry occur among butterflies and moths. Predators of these insects must use visual cues to hunt for prey. Otherwise, similar color patterns would not matter to the potential predators. Increasing evidence indicates that Batesian mimicry can involve non-visual cues such as olfaction, although such examples are less obvious to humans. So as you can see here, Batesian mimicry. So we have a pipe vine, swallowtail butterflies. So Batis felinae are protected from birds and other predators by the poisonous compounds they derive from the food they eat as caterpillars and store in their bodies. Adult pipe vine swallowtails advertise their poisonous nature with a warning coloration. Tiger swallowtails, Papilloglaucus, are Batesian mimics of the poisonous pipe vine swallowtail and are not chemically protected. Another kind of mimicry, Mullerian mimicry, was named for the German biologist Fritz Müller, who first described it in 1878. In Mullerian mimicry, several unrelated but protected animal species come to resemble one another. If animals that resemble one another are all poisonous or dangerous, they gain an advantage because the predator will learn more quickly to avoid them. In some cases, predator populations even evolve to an innate avoidance of species, such as the evolution may occur more quickly than the multiple dangerous prey look-alike. In both Batesian and Mullerian mimicry, mimic and model must not only look alike, but also act alike. For example, members of several families of insects closely resemble wasps, behave like wasps they mimic, flying often actively from place to place. So here at B, pairs of Mullerian mimics, we have examples of heliconius butterflies. So the first Heliconius auratum, and then we have Heliconius melpomene are sympatric, and then Heliconius sappho and Heliconius sydno are sympatric. All these butterflies are distasteful. They have evolved similar coloration patterns in sympatry to minimize predation. Predators need only learn one pattern to avoid. The plants, animals, protists, fungi, and prokaryotes that live together in communities have changed and adjusted to one another continually over millions of years. We've already discussed competition and predation, but other types of ecological interactions commonly occur. For example, many features of flowering plants have evolved to attract beneficial animals. These animals, in turn, have evolved a number of special traits to enable them to obtain food or other resources efficiently from the plants they visit, often from their flowers. While doing so, the plants provide a service. By doing so, the animals provide a service to the plants, picking up pollen, which they may deposit on the next plant they visit, or eating fruits which contain seeds that they transport elsewhere in the environment, sometimes a great distance from the parent plant. In symbiosis, two or more kinds of organisms interact in often elaborate or more or less permanent relationships. All symbiotic relationships carry the potential for coevolution between the organisms involved, and in many instances, the results of this coevolution are fascinatingly complex. Lichens, which are associations of certain fungi with green algae or cyanobacteria, are one example of symbiosis. Another important example are mycorrhizae, associations between fungi and the roots of most kinds of plants. The fungi expedite the plant's absorption of certain nutrients, and the plants in turn provide the fungi with carbohydrates. Both mycorrhizae and lichens are discussed in Chapter 31 with fungi. Similarly, root nodules that occur in legumes and certain other kinds of plants contain bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen and make it available to their host plants. The major kinds of symbiotic relationships include mutualism, in which both participating species benefit, parasitism, in which one species benefits but the other is harmed, and commensalism, in which one species benefits and the other neither benefits or is harmed. Parasitism can also be viewed as a form of predation, although the organism that is preyed on does not necessarily die. Mutualism is a symbiotic relationship between organisms in which both species benefit. Mutualistic relationships are of fundamental importance in determining the structure of biological communities. Some of the most spectacular examples of mutualism occur among flowering plants and their animal visitors, including insects, birds, and bats. During the course of flowering plant evolution, the characteristics of flowers evolved in relation to characteristics of animals that visit them for food. In the process, spread their pollen from individual to individual. At the same time, characteristics of the animals have changed, increasing their specialization for obtaining food or other substances from particular kinds of flowers. A particularly striking example of mutualism involves ants and certain Latin American tree species of the genus Acacia. In these species, certain leaf parts called stipules are modified as paired hollow thorns. The thorns are inhabited by stinging ants, which do not nest anywhere else. Like all thorns that occur on plants, the acacia thorns serve to deter herbivores. At the tip of the leaflets of these acacias are unique protein-rich bodies called Beltian bodies, named after the 19th century British naturalist Thomas Belt. Beltian bodies do not occur in species of acacia that are not inhabited by ants, and their role is clear. They serve as a primary food for the ants. In addition, the plants secrete nectar from glands near the bases of leaves. The ants consume the nectar as well, feeding it to the Beltian bodies to their larvae. Obviously, this association is beneficial to the ants, and one can really see why they inhabit acacias of this group. The ants and their larvae are protected within the soil and thorns, and the trees provide a balanced diet, including a sugar-rich nectar for the protein-rich Beltian bodies. So what, if anything, do the ants do for the plants? Whenever any herbivorous insect lands on the branches or leaves of the acacias inhabited by ants, ants which continually patrol the acacia's branches immediately attack and devour the herbivore. So that's what happens when a herbivorous insect lands on the branches. So the ants live in the acacias to help their hosts compete with other plants by cutting away any encroaching branches that touch the acacia on which they're living. They create, in effect, a tunnel of light through which the acacia can grow, even in the lush tropical rainforest, a lowland of Central America. In fact, when any colony is experimentally removing from a tree, the acacia is unable to compete successfully. Finally, the ants bring organic material to the nests, the part they do not consume. Together with the excretions, provide the acacias with an abundant source of nitrogen. Parasitism is harmful to the prey organism and beneficial to the parasite. In many cases, the parasite kills the host, and thus the ecological effects of parasitism can be similar to those of predation. Parasites that feed on the exterior surface of an organism are external parasites, or ectoparasites. Many instances of external parasitism are known in both plants and animals. Ticks, lice, and mites are common ectoparasites that affect humans. Yellow vines, or the flowering plant dodder, is external parasites that obtains its food from the host plant it grows on. Parasites that live within the body of their host are termed endoparasites, occur in different phyla of animals and protists. Internal parasitism is generally marked by much more extreme specialization than external parasitism, as shown by the many protists and invertebrate parasites that infect humans. In commensalism, one species benefits and the other is neither hurt nor helped by the interaction. In nature, individuals of one species are often physically attached to members of another. For example, epiphytes are plants that grow on the branches of other plants. In general, the host plant is unharmed, and the epiphyte that grows on it benefits. An example is Spanish moss, which you're seeing here. So it hangs on trees in the southern United States. This plant and other members of its genus, which is in the pineapple family, grow on trees to gain access to sunlight. They generally do not harm the trees. Oxpeckers grazing on and grazing animals. So oxpeckers eats parasites off grazers. The grazer may receive a benefit, which might be mutualism, so this may not be an example of commensalism, and sometimes picks scabs and drinks blood. So again, this might be parasitism, because the grazer may be weakened and even become infected. Ecological processes have interactive effects. We have seen the different ways in which species can interact with one another. In nature, however, more than one type of interaction often occurs at the same time. In many cases, the outcome of one interaction is modified or even reversed when another type of interaction is also occurring. Starfish eat barnacles, allowing other species to thrive instead of being crowded out by the explosive population of barnacles. And let's get to our example here. Species whose effects on the composition of communities are greater than one might expect based on their abundances are termed keystone species. Predators such as the sea star I just mentioned can often serve as keystone species by preventing one species from outcompeting others, thus maintaining high levels of species richness in a community. A wide variety of other types of keystone species also exist. Some species manipulate the environment in ways that create new habitats for others. Beavers, for example, change running streams into small impoundments, altering the flow of water and flooding areas. Similarly, alligators excavate deep holes at the bottom of lakes. In times of drought, these holes are the only areas where water remains, thus allowing aquatic species that otherwise would perish to persist until drought ends and the lake refills. Even when the climate of an area remains stable year after year, communities have a tendency to change from simple to complex in a process known as succession. This process is familiar to anyone who has seen a vacant lot or cleared woods slowly become occupied by an increasing number of species. If a wooded area is cleared or burned and left alone, plants will slowly reclaim the area. Eventually, all traces of the clearing will disappear, and the area will again be woods. This kind of succession, which occurs in areas where an existing community has been disturbed but organisms still remain, is called secondary succession. In contrast, primary succession occurs on bare, lifeless substrates such as rocks or in open water, where organisms gradually move into an area and change its nature. Primary succession occurs on land exposed after the retreat of glaciers and on volcanic islands that arise from the sea. Primary succession in formerly glaciated areas provides an example, which you're seeing here. On the bare, mineral-poor ground exposed when glaciers recede, soil pH is basic as a result of carbohydrates in the rocks, and nitrogen levels are low. Lichens are the first vegetation able to grow under such conditions. Acidic secretions from the lichens help break down the substrate and reduce the pH, as well as adding to the accumulation of soil. Mosses then colonize these packets of soil, eventually building up enough nutrients in the soil for alder shrubs to take hold. Over 100 years, the alders, which have symbiotic bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen, increase soil nitrogen levels, and their acidic leaves further lower the pH. Eventually, spruce trees grow above the alders and shade them, crowding them out entirely, forming a dense spruce forest. So what you're seeing here is at B, recently deglaciated area at Glacier Bay, Alaska, that had little soil nitrogen. From there, you had those pioneer moss species. They're at should come in, and then at C, within 20 years, young alder shrubs have taken hold, and then at D, you then have the spruce outgrowing those mature alders. In a similar example, an oligotrophic lake, one poor in nutrients, may gradually by the accumulation of organic matter, become eutrophic, rich in nutrients. As this occurs, the composition of communities will change, first increasing in species richness, then declining. Succession happens because species alter the habitat and the resources available in it in ways that favor other species. Three dynamic concepts are of critical importance to the process. Let's go back to that. First up is establishment. Early successional stages are characterized by weedy or selected species that are tolerant of harsh abiotic conditions in barren areas. Then there is facilitation. The weedy early successional stages introduce local changes in the habitat that favor other less weedy species. Thus, the mosses of Glacier Bay succession convert nitrogen to form that allow alders to invade. Similarly, the nitrogen buildup produced by the alders, though not necessary for spruce establishment, leads to more robust forests of spruce better able to resist attack by insects. Sometimes the changes in the habitat are caused by one species, while favoring other species, also inhibit the growth of the original species that caused the changes. Alders, for example, do not grow well in acidic soils as the spruce and hemlock that replace them. Over the course of succession, the number of species typically increases as the environment becomes less hospitable. As the environment becomes more hospitable. In some cases, however, as ecosystems mature, more selected species replace our selected ones, and superior competitors force out other species, leading ultimately to a decline in species richness. The species of animals present in a community also change through time in a successional pattern. As the vegetation changes during succession, habitat disappears for some species and appears for others. A particularly striking example occurred at Krakatoa Islands of Indonesia, which were devastated by an enormous volcanic eruption in 1883. Initially composed of nothing but barren ash fields, the three islands of the group experienced rapid successional change as vegetation became reestablished. A few blades of grass appeared the next year, and within 15 years, the coastal vegetation was well established, and the interior was covered by dense grasslands. By 1930, the islands were almost entirely forested, which you're seeing right here now from a left to right in figure 55.25a and b, respectively. The fauna of Krakatoa changed in synchrony with the vegetation. 9 months after the eruption, the only animal found was a single spider, but by 1908, 200 animal species were found in a 3-day exploration. For the most part, the first animals were grassland inhabitants, but as trees became established, some of the early colonists, such as zebra dove and the long-tailed shrike, a type of predatory bird, disappeared and were replaced by forest-inhabiting species such as fruit bats and fruit-eating birds. Although patterns of succession of animal species have typically been caused by vegetational succession changes in the composition of the animal community, in turn have affected plant occurrences. In particular, many plant species that are animal dispersed or animal pollinated could not colonize Krakatoa until their dispersers or pollinators had become established. For example, fruit bats were slow to colonize Krakatoa, and until they appeared, few bat dispersed plants were present. Traditionally, many ecologists considered biological communities to be a state of equilibrium, a stable condition that resisted change and fairly quickly returned to its original state if disturbed by humans or natural events. Such stability was usually attributed to the process of interspecific competition. In recent years, this viewpoint has been reevaluated. Increasingly, scientists are recognizing that communities are constantly changing as a result of climatic changes, species colonizations, and disturbance events. As a result, many ecologists now invoke non-equilibrium models that emphasize change rather than stability. A particular focus of ecological research concerns the role that disturbances play in determining the structure of communities. Disturbances can be widespread or local. Severe disturbances such as forest fires, droughts, and floods may affect large areas. Animals may also cause severe disruptions. Gypsy moths can devastate a forest by consuming all the leaves on its trees. Unregulated deer populations may grow explosively, the deer overgrazing and destroying the forests in which they live. On the other hand, local disturbances may affect only a small area as well when a tree falls in a forest or an animal digs a hole that uproots vegetation. In some cases, disturbance may act to increase the species richness of an area. According to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, communities experiencing moderate amounts of disturbance will have higher levels of species richness than communities experiencing either little or great amounts of disturbance. Two factors could account for this pattern. First, in communities where moderate amounts of disturbance occur, patches of habitat exist at different successional stages. Within the area as a whole, then species diversity is greatest because the full range of species, those characteristics of all stages of succession, are present. For example, intermediate episodic disturbance that produces gaps in the forest, as when a tree falls, allow invasion of the gap by other species. Eventually, the species inhabiting the gap will go through a successional sequence, one tree replacing another, until a canopy tree species comes again to occupy the gap. But if there are many gaps in different stages in the forest, many different species will be coexisting, some in young gaps, others in older gaps. Second, moderate levels of disturbance may prevent communities from reaching the final stages of succession, in which few dominant competitors eliminate most of the other species. In contrast, too much disturbance might leave the community continually in the earliest stages of succession when species richness is relatively low. Ecologists are increasingly realizing that disturbance is common rather than exceptional in many communities. As a result, the idea that communities inexorably move along a successional trajectory culminating in the development of predictable end-state or climax community is no longer widely accepted. Rather, predicting the state of a community in the future may be difficult because the unpredictable occurrence of disturbances will often counter successional changes. Understanding the role that disturbances play in structuring communities is currently an important area of investigation in ecology. What you're seeing here is a single fallen tree created a small light gap in the tropical rainforest of Panama. Such gaps play that key role in maintaining high species diversity of the rainforest, and in this case, that sunlight-loving plant is able to sprout up amidst the dense foliage of trees in the forest. This has been your instructor, Scholar Huff. Prepare well for